This week's Fearful Symmetry Friday is coming from Chapter 6, Tradition and Experiment, Section 4, and we're going to see the debt that Blake owed to Milton. It's going to be talking about liberty and what the creative force in man is. And I think I'm picking this passage because I think it particularly relates to what's happening now with Sargon of Akkad and Patreon and that whole mess there. And the Areopagitica is brought up here, which I have on screen here by Milton. And I think I want to do a reading from that as well. I was going to include it in this video, but I just don't have time tonight. So I will start the reading from Northrop Frye's Fearful Symmetry. The ritual is a vision of truth which has become false only because it has sunk to the level of physical acts within the order of nature. Reforming the Church, therefore, includes the emancipation of rite and ceremony into an imaginative vision in which their symbolic reality is purified of its natural element. This part of our task would be much easier if Blake had left us an extended comment on Spenser paralleling his essay on Chaucer. The full consideration of Blake's debt to Milton will have to be postponed until we come to the poem by Blake which bears Milton's name. Though obviously far on the left of Calvinism, Milton never adopted anything like an Anabaptist point of view, and whatever interest he may have had in occult philosophy does not seem to the present writer to have permeated very deeply into his thinking. But no one identifies poetry with prophecy or expresses the responsibility of the creative artist to God for his genius more clearly than Milton. Milton's liberty, end quote, is practically the same thing as Blake's imagination, and whenever Milton talks about reason, he means it in the sense of the, quote, bound or outward circumference of energy, end quote, which liberty supplies. Liberty for Milton is the total release of the whole man, and his main effort in defining it is to break down the partitions in which the timid and cautious attempt to keep its various aspects separate. That is, the, quote, Christian liberty, end quote, of the theologians is not a different thing from political liberty, and the, quote, liberty to know and utter, end quote, inevitably expands into the liberty to love. It is in the Areopagitica that Milton is nearest to Blake, and Areopagitica supplies for the student of Blake not only a guide to most of Blake's leading ideas, but an illustration of many of his symbols. It was undoubtedly a major influence in forming Blake's doctrine that the Christian Church cannot exist outside the arts because the secondary Word of God, which unites us to the primary person of Christ, is a book and not a ceremony. Milton also shows that the impulse to destroy art by censorship makes general morality a criterion which the creative imagination must meet. But moral virtue of this kind is founded on the fallen state of man. It is the forbidden knowledge of good and evil, the tree of death which lost man paradise, and therefore it can never give man back a vision of paradise. The more one pursues moral virtue, the more obviously one becomes engaged in a pursuit of death. Quote, the laziness of a licensing church, end quote, detests everything that has any exuberance, and its ultimate aim is the legalized, quote, blank virtue, end quote, of the Pharisee, which Jesus saw for what it was, the, quote, excremental whiteness, end quote, of the outside of a tomb. For general truth does not exist. Truth exists only in the total form which the mind makes of reality. Hence no doctrine which a man assents to because he is told to do so can be true for him. The city of God is built not out of continuous, but out of contiguous stones. And social order is a unity of varieties, like the work of art, not the dead and frozen unity of unintelligent assent which all tyranny attempts to reach, quote, a staunch and solid piece of framework, as any January could freeze together, end quote. The greatness of Areopagitica is that it speaks for liberty, not tolerance. It is not the plea of a nervous intellectual who hopes that a brutal majority will at least leave him alone, but a demand for the release of creative power and a vision of an imaginative culture in which the genius is not an intellectual so much as a prophet and seer. The release of creative genius is the only social problem that matters, for such a release is not in granting of extra privileges to a small class, but the unbinding of a titan in man, who will soon begin to tear down the sun and moon and enter paradise. The creative impulse in man is God in man. The work of art or the good book is an image of God, and to kill it is to put out the perceiving eye of God. God has nothing to do with routine morality and invariable truth. He is a joyous God for whom too much is enough, and exuberance beauty, a God who gave every Israelite in the desert 3 times as much manna as he could possibly eat. No one can really speak for liberty without passing through revolution to apocalypse. And here's a block quote. He who thinks we are to pitch our tent here and have attained the utmost prospect of reformation, that the mortal glass wherein we contemplate can show us, till we come to beatific vision, that man by this very opinion declares that he is yet far short of truth. End quote. For England is, quote, rousing herself like a strong man after sleep, end quote. And though God usually reveals his will to England first, the regeneration of England will inevitably spread to all humanity, and humanity will then appear as an awakening man, whose home is Jerusalem, the city of God. The Reformation purified Christianity. To purify Christianity is to release human liberty. To release liberty is to kindle a flame that can never be extinguished until it is merged in the final consummation of all things. And this liberty, properly understood, is the spirit of prophecy. Another block quote. For now the time seems come, wherein Moses, the great prophet, may sit in heaven rejoicing to see that memorable and glorious wish of his fulfilled, when not only our 70 elders, but all the Lord's people are become prophets. End quote. The passage in the Bible that this refers to was taken by Blake as a motto for his own poem on Milton. The beatific vision of which Milton speaks is, from Blake's point of view, to be found in him in its complete integrity only here. In the epics there is still much that is generalized and doctrinal, as there is in the opposite camp in the liberal conformism of Vaughan and Traherne. For in Milton's day the Renaissance was cooling into its winter, and the thick, quote, triple ice of abstract thought which Blake called deism and Milton Catholicism was forming over the living waters of truth once more. But it is already evident that Blake's affinities with the Renaissance go much deeper than a few Shakespearean echoes in his early songs. Had he been born at any time between, say, 1530 and 1630, he would have found a large public able to speak his language. His premises would have been accepted on their own merits, and he could have offered to the world, in Spenser's phrase, a continued allegory, or dark conceit, without being told that poets should not invent a private symbolism. That's where I'm going to end this week's reading from Fearful Symmetry. If you like this sort of thing, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope you can see the parallels and the important information regarding the censorship that's happening now with Patreon and Sargon of Akkad and so forth, and how William Blake relates to this and how Jordan Peterson is going to be relating to this.